Joining us to discuss Detroit, we have a China problem. Please welcome founder and president at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, Dr. Rob Atkinson, policy director at American Compass, Chris Griswold, and senior fellow at Hudson Institute, David Feith. Moderated by executive director of SAFE's Coalition for Reimagined Mobility, Rachel McCleery.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to our panelists for being here today. So while we debate the merits of U.S. consumer access to Chinese vehicles, nearly 7,000 miles from here, the Beijing Auto Show is underway. Companies like BYD and Geely and others are showcasing vehicles that are not just cheaper than vehicles available in the U.S., they're unlike anything we have here. So I'd really like to start by asking each of you a simple question, and that's, so what? A recent survey from Cox Automotive showed that U.S. consumers are increasingly open to purchasing Chinese vehicles, especially younger generations. When it comes to national security, there's just this growing sentiment that's been around for a while in this internet age that China already has all my information. They've got access to my data. So if a Chinese automaker wants to sell me a vehicle that's way more advanced, it's 50 to 60% cheaper for what I can get off of a dealer lot here, why shouldn't they be able to? I'd love to hear each of your takes, starting here with David.
Well, I think those consumer and public sentiment figures are important, but it's also the case that we as a country, as consumers and as policymakers, have chosen cheaper and seemingly more attractive Chinese goods and engagement with China for years to mostly catastrophic effect. In cars in particular, there are enormous and seemingly obvious dangers of surveillance and of sabotage, and perhaps less obvious but no more important dangers of strategic leverage. We don't want the Chinese Communist Party to be able to expand its already substantial ability to leverage us, to deny us critical inputs to our economy, as we've seen in areas like critical minerals, in ways that would also extend to cars and car technology.
Chris?
Yeah, I guess my starting premise here is that nothing is ever for free, right? So, I mean, do we honestly believe that what's happening is the Chinese are just so much better at making cars and want to sell them to us cheap out of the goodness of their hearts? No, there's a goal, and the goal is control. It is the stated goal of the Chinese Communist Party to achieve geopolitical and industrial dominance. They've been pursuing that playbook with some success for years, as David has said. And let's just, by analogy, think of what's been happening in critical minerals, right? When we have a dispute with China, their threat is to constrict the flow of the critical minerals we depend on. They are willing to sacrifice short-term profit in an industry that they control to achieve their geopolitical goals. And if we think that's a problem, just the control over one important input in a supply chain, imagine what it would be like for them to have total control of a vertically integrated supply chain all the way up to a whole critical sector in the United States that it contributes something like 5% of GDP, and that employs a bunch of Americans. And then what happens? Because this is not a situation in which Chinese automakers would be principally interested in competing freely and fairly for profit the way American companies are. They are subject to the whims of the CCP, which is willing to sacrifice those short-term profits if it needs to. And there's nothing stopping that from happening with a Chinese automaker that's making things here. That could absolutely happen. If we let China come in and build a BYD factory or whatever, and they employ 5,000 Americans, and we get into dispute and say, well, no, that's over with. Yep. Now imagine we let that happen for 10 years, and because they're cheaper, now they've wiped out the American auto industry. They control the whole sector, and we get into dispute with them, and they just say no. They're willing to do that. They do that, and that's a absolutely terrible idea. Mm-hmm.
Rob?
I'm with him. So look, this is not the furniture industry. This is not the Happy Meal toy industry. This is really one of the most important industries in the U.S. And what we're looking at is let's be honest, the destruction of the industry, or dramatic downsizing. The industry employs 47,000 engineers. It spends $26 billion on R&D every year. It's a key role in metalworking, mechanical engineering, has 5,600 suppliers all around the country. This is why DoD just went to the big two last week or the week before and asked them to start considering making weapons like we did in World War II. So this is a critical industry, not just because of the dual use capabilities, but because of the underlying enabling capabilities that this industry provides for the US. And frankly, we're not doing very well. We have a new report will be coming out next week or the week after, looking at the latest OECD data on value added in major industries across 70 countries or so. And what you can do is calculate what's called a location quotient, the amount of autos as a share of our GDP versus the global autos versus global GDP. Our location quotient fell from 0.9 in 1999 down to 0.54 today. In other words, we have about half of the auto value added that the world has. So that's how far we've shrunk. And that includes transplants in the US. The Chinese in 2022, latest data was 1.4, so they're probably about 1.6, 1.7 by now. So then the question is, who cares? And I think the biggest sin, the biggest failure that we're going to make in the US on this is that we still think in terms of consumer welfare. And that's a wonderful standard. It's a wonderful standard when we're competing among ourselves, or it's a wonderful standard when we're competing with our allies. But we can't be thinking about the consumer welfare standard when we're dealing with China. I would make this as akin to essentially vehicular fentanyl. The Chinese essentially want to destroy our industry. That's what they want to do. And the fact that we would go along with that, because the enviros say, oh, we'll get some green cars, and the consumer advocates say, we'll get some cheap cars, and some of the politicians will say it'll help with inflation. And we're overlooking several things. One is the reason why they're so competitive. Let's be honest, it's not all fair competition. There's a recent study by a company in Detroit that does auto breakdowns, and they found that the low profitability of OEMs and suppliers in China accounts for a 14% cost advantage. So right there, and we say, well, why don't they have high profits? Because low profits are a strategy for the Chinese. It's to gain market share. Second, subsidies. Subsidies are at least 10% of vehicle costs in China, probably more because we don't measure subsidies accurately. We have a whole three-part series on autos that we've just come out with, 2 of them. And then lastly, wages not matching productivity. It appears that the automobile sector in China is as productive as our sector is. They use more than twice as many industrial robots as the US automakers do. Sorry, automakers in the US do, twice as many. And a lot of that is subsidized. The Chinese are putting in billions and billions of dollars every year to subsidize robot adoption. We're closer to India in robot adoption than we are closer to China. And so, last point I'll make is, if you go back and you study international economics, there's sort of this one kind of core belief or axiom, which is that you can compete with low-wage countries because low-wage countries have low productivity. So think about a line. Low wages, how can we compete with them? Well, their productivity is terrible. High-wage countries have high productivity. China's the only country in the world that's broken that relationship. They have high productivity and 30% of the fully loaded labor costs. There is simply no way you can compete against that. It's impossible unless you have a tariff or bans or other things like that, or radically devalue the dollar. Those are the only choices, because absent that, after the deluge, we'll have Marie Antoinette riding around in a BYD.
Now that's an image for the audience. I'd like to go back to you, David, and follow up with the story that Rob mentioned about the Wall Street Journal reporting that the Pentagon is talking to Ford and GM about boosting weapons production. Given your background as an NSC official and where you stood previously within the federal government, I would love for you to share with our audience, what does that really look like? Walk us through an example if China establishes an industrial manufacturing footprint in America and we are on opposing ends of a global crisis.
Well, I think it's interesting. The point about the absolute centrality of the automotive industrial base in America to national power, measured both in the direct ability of that industrial base to be repurposed or multi-purposed for defense industrial production, which is something we've seen at different times in our history and something that the Trump administration is now looking to recreate. But also, the measure of national power is also seen simply in the relevance of the automotive industrial base to the manufacturing industrial base generally, and for purely commercial purposes, right? The process knowledge that comes from having a substantial domestic manufacturing base, especially in automotive historically, has been absolutely essential to manufacturing innovation and productivity and general economic strength in the United States for a very long time. That is a point, to be honest, I associate more with SAFE, which has been making this point for a long time and helped educate me on the point, than with the US government. The US government forsook that point for a very long time. Credit to the US government today for moving back in that direction, and it's a very good thing. But I think we need to relearn the lesson of the absolute significance, especially when we are, I think, flirting with policy measures that could cause major expansion of the sort of China-related threat surface to this crucial manufacturing and industrial and technology base. To answer your scenario question, I think that the scenarios here are, can broadly be bucketed across surveillance, sabotage, and leverage. The surveillance is that cars are, obviously platforms that enable enormously capable surveillance of our roads, of our critical infrastructure, of our people, of government facilities, of all kinds of relevant areas where we would not, I think, benefit from inviting such capable, multi-domain Chinese surveillance as we would have through Chinese cars, certainly, and even through Chinese automobile inputs. And the surveillance piece was one of the two main that motivated, I think, very justifiably, the Biden administration's Commerce Department-led restrictions on Chinese car tech that they put forward in 2024. They highlighted the surveillance risk, and then they highlighted secondarily the sabotage risk. And that's the risk that these cars, like most technology platforms these days, are subject to remote access, remote updates, and remote control, which is another way of saying remote sabotage if an adversarial actor wanted to use these platforms as platforms of sabotage in a crisis or conflict, which is very easy to imagine. It should have been easy to imagine all along. It's easier to imagine still after Ukraine, after Iran, after Israel and Hezbollah. This is not a failure of imagination that any of us would be forgiven for making still. The third key category is one I think we've touched on nicely, which is the strategic leverage point, which is that the Chinese Communist Party structures its international economic strategy for control, as we've heard. China wants to make itself essentially a super OPEC. They want to be a single country, not a group of a dozen or so countries. They want to be a single country that controls not one, but the key range of critical inputs into the future world economy, ours and that of the rest of the world. It's the explanation for their approach to semiconductors, it's their explanation for the approach to minerals, and it certainly explains the approach to cars and car technology. And I think we shouldn't make it so easy for them.
Thank you. Chris, over to you. Chinese automakers have received an estimated $239 billion in state-backed subsidies since 2009. I mean, this is money that you try to find an example to, and aside from it being the GDP of a handful of countries, it's really hard to put that into perspective. But if that wasn't enough, the Chinese government is also circumventing US tariffs by the practice of corporate knockdowns. And for the audience, that's where Chinese firms ship nearly finished vehicles on major components to the US through Mexico or Canada. we're hearing from automakers that this is certainly a problem. We've been hearing it for a while. I'm curious, and I know there are other circumvention methods we'll talk about in a moment, but with corporate knockdowns specifically, how big of a threat is this? How big of a concern is it?
That's a fantastic question, and I will politely, completely ignore it and answer a totally different question. No, but seriously, I will come around to that through the scenic route, because there are, I think, a couple things Rob said that are really important to just sit with for a minute. And the first is on the consumer welfare standard and the idea that low consumer prices should be the be-all and the end-all of how we evaluate economic policy. By the way, vehicular fentanyl is a fantastic phrase that I will be stealing in the future. I hope you don't mind. IP theft, like
as Dustin Hoffman said at Midnight Cowboy, if it's free, it's not stealing.
I think it's worth pointing out that the consumer welfare standard, when you elevate, of course we want things to be cheap rather than expensive, and of course we need to take affordability questions extremely seriously. The problem with that analysis is that if you elevate the consumer welfare standard to this kind of absolute metric, eventually it fails on its own terms. And I think we are at risk of, if we forget that in this instance, we're at immense risk. I mean, let's think about what happened the first time we confronted this kind of question in 2000, when we let China as the WTO, granted it permanent normal trade relations status, and American industry migrated en masse to production in China. We did get cheaper consumer goods. We also got the hollowing out of American industry in ways that have had economic consequences that are still being felt in many, many communities. And it is not the case that life is more affordable or that a middle class standard of living is more accessible to the average worker now than it was 20 or 30 years ago. It's harder, in part because and this is the deep irony of it, in part because we elevated the consumer welfare standard to this kind of absolute dogmatic state. So I really appreciate you bringing up that point, and I want to put a big underline under that, and I hope it kind of hovers over this whole day's conversation, because it's important. And the second thing that you said that relates to your question is the question of comparative advantage, right? This classic economics concept that we should all specialize in the things that we know how to do best, and then when we trade, we'll all be better off. And that made sense when, David Ricardo in the 1700s was talking about like sheep and wine from England and Portugal or whatever. But there is nothing in the soil of China that makes it naturally better at growing autos. In the 21st century, in the highly complex, integrated global economy, comparative advantage is not discovered, it's decided. It's a policy choice. It's a matter of policy. China decided that it was going to do this with autos. And this now gets to your question, because the only answer to policy is policy. And the function of a well-crafted tariff regime, in part, is to countervail all of the subsidies that you just mentioned. If the Chinese Communist Party decides it's going to sell things under cost to gain market share, as Rob said, and gain these strategic advantages, as David's been talking about, if that's what they want to do, and it's the price differential that they're weaponizing to do that, well, you can correct for that. You can just say, actually, no, it's not cheaper to import that into the United States. Here's a tariff. Now it's the same, or now it's more, or whatever. And so so that's the principled question. And once we get our head around the principle that actually, no, we do have tools, we are allowed, not only are we allowed to respond, we must, using, among other things, trade tools. Well, then the question becomes how to do that in practice.
Yes.
And if you don't allow for these other circumvention, methods that you're talking about, if you don't calculate that into your tariff regime, well, then you have a huge problem. And so the thing that I'm really worried about now is that, for example, if President Trump goes and meets with Xi Jinping and puts Chinese FDI on the table and said, yeah, sure, BYD, come and build a factory here, that's great. Not only is that bad on its own terms, as we've been talking about, it's bad because the folks, the good folks at USTR, for example, who understand this deeply, have been going around to all of our trading partners negotiating tougher standards on China into those countries. There's an internal logic that the administration's policy is meant to pursue that will be undermined, not just for us, but for all the people we're also trying to convince to be tough on China. So it's essential to address not only the knockdown, but the whole menu of strategies that China is using to circumvent tariffs. Either we're going to do this or we're not. And if we are, then yeah, we have to take it extremely seriously.
Thank you. Rob, ITIF has warned that allowing subsidized Chinese automakers like BYD to enter the US market could trigger an extinction level event for the American auto industry. This is a question for you and for all of you, but what about licensing IP? We're starting to see some of this already with Ford for battery and tech needs. What is your position on this? Is this a bridge to get somewhere else, or are we just playing right into the hands of the Chinese government by pursuing this type of a deal?
So the car issue is actually pretty easy, really, at the end of the day. If we impose tariffs, or I would just put outright bans, import bans, in reality, prices go up, but they go up for consumers. And so, not to be cavalier, but that's the price we have to pay for our kids' future. Inputs are different, because if you raise input prices, this is why semiconductor tariffs are so problematic, because you raise input prices and you potentially affect competitiveness of the companies in the US. Having said that, though, I think we just got to go cold turkey on China for these inputs. So they're great Korean battery companies. They face the exact same challenge that our automakers face with Korean batteries: mass subsidization, IP theft, closed markets. And the great line by Lenin, the capitalists will sell you the rope to hang themselves by, and the capitalists here will buy anything that will hang the other guy, because that's their job, and I'm not knocking them for it. The job of a CEO is to do the best you can for your shareholders. But that is sometimes inconsistent with state interests. And so I would put batteries in that category. We're not buying the batteries. We get them from the Koreans or the Japanese or whoever else wants to make them. And if we import them, that's fine.
Rob?
Well, I appreciate Rob kind of putting cold turkey on the table, because when it comes certainly to actual greenfield FDI and production in the US, that is absolutely the only answer. A ban is the correct policy. It just needs to be done. And I would put IP under that banner as well. It also, not to put too fine a point on it, our history vis-a-vis China and their trustworthiness with respect to IP is not great. Like the track record does not recommend us somehow like naively convincing ourselves that no, wait, this time it's going to be just fine to give Chinese companies, that lever of control over our production as well. It's just not. I don't think it's wise. And I think Rob is right that like we're either doing this or we're not, and we need to do it top to bottom.
Thanks, Chris. David?
Well, at the risk of bringing about a chorus of violent agreement, I would happily or grimly associate myself, completely with my colleagues' views here. But I think the conversations that are happening in various circles about technology partnerships, licensing, what sometimes gets perhaps, honestly referred to as a kind of a reverse tech transfer strategy that U.S. car makers with U.S. government support would undertake toward China, feels too smart by half, among other things. I think it expects of the U.S. system, both industrial and governmental, a far greater capacity to pull off this imagined reverse tech transfer than is probably justified. The entire Chinese system is designed to do what China was very effectively able to do with forced JVs and onshoring standards and theft and an extremely aggressive and multi-level central government and local government and official and unofficial range of measures that the Chinese system was able to impose on global car makers in the sector for a very long time with great success. It's not how our system is designed at all. And it seems a very high stakes experiment in a kind of frankly brute force economic policy, if pursued one way, or a highly surgical and exquisite kind of industrial policy, neither of which we have any record of really pulling off. And I think the allied point is especially important. Japan and Korea are the main rivals to China in batteries, other than some American players as well, of course. We have an enormous interest in cooperating with Japan and Korea on a whole range of things, including critical industrial cooperation. The idea that we would abandon that cooperation, certainly deprioritize it, by pursuing cooperation instead with Chinese partners who have talented engineers and great technology, but are subject to and all too often instruments of the kind of fundamentally subversive and coercive policies of Beijing, would be not only a problem vis-a-vis US-China sort of strategic vulnerability, but a huge step down in what ought to be key US allied strategic and industrial cooperation. It is what indeed we have trade negotiators encouraging important allies on, and I think we should be focusing there.
Thank you, David. Vehicles are more than just a means of getting from one point to another now. I mean, that's a massive understatement. These are iPads on 4 wheels, increasingly so with what China is putting out. And this entire evolution is why my Coalition for Reimagined Mobility issued a report last year called AI in Motion that called on the US to treat AI-enabled transportation as a strategic priority within the administration's push for AI dominance. So Rob, I'd like to ask you, talking more about these intersections with AI dominance goals, how important is innovation in autonomous and connected vehicles, software stacks, to meeting this overall agenda, to competing with China on AI specifically?
Yeah, it's really not clear the U.S. is gonna be all that enamored consumers with electric vehicles. As you know, we're just different. We like big vehicles. We live in the suburbs. All these things. But maybe we'll get there. But one thing that is 100% for sure is that fully level 4. By the way, you get almost all the benefits from autonomy at level 4. You don't need level 5. Level 5 is when you don't need an Uber driver, which, nice benefits to the economy. It's the level 4 benefits that are huge, because that's where you get dramatically fewer accidents. I like to joke, everybody says, there's going to be this job apocalypse, and everybody says, lawyers and think tanks. I mean, that's going to be awful. The biggest job loser is going to be auto body repair people, because you're just not going to get in an accident anymore. So I think autonomy is the central thing. If we can get autonomy right, we're going to really have an advantage, and people are going to want to buy autonomous vehicles just for the safety reasons alone. But also, you drive on the freeway, and you can, you can be 4 feet, 3 feet, and just the throughput on the roadway will be significantly higher, less road congestion, all of that stuff. The Chinese are way ahead of us on a policy perspective. They're like, they don't care. They just want to get there. We got DC yammering about should they allow. Where is my autonomous Uber in DC? I've been waiting for it. When I go to San Francisco, I can get one. And they're like, oh, well, we're not sure, we're not sure, we're not sure. So I commend the Trump administration for pushing on this, but I think we really have to push on it. There's a test bed that I think DOT may be helping fund in Michigan, which is a kind of an autonomous vehicle test bed. We should be doing way more of those sorts of things. We should be essentially forcing states to allow AVs on the road, so I think that's a really, really important part of the future.
That's great. And David, in a similar vein, the delta between traditional policy and tech policy, in my view, is just dramatically shrinking. We're looking at a future where there won't just be an IRA or a CHIPS Act, it'll be an amalgamation of the two to address all of these problems that we're talking about. What automakers like Ford and GM need to be competitive is looking increasingly more like what driverless tech companies need. So what can the government do in this autonomous policy space and AI-enabled advanced vehicle technology here in the US to give these companies certainty that investing in these advanced technologies is going to pay off for them, that they can be profitable and globally competitive when, as Rob had said, China is already so far ahead of the game?
Well, I think the question raises a really important point about how we draw definitions and categories of problems and solutions alike. And so, for example, in the relationship between cars and robotics is an obvious and natural one, and I think Rob's comments highlighted it. The question highlights it. We would naturally want to do things that recognize that cars are computers on wheels, if you want to put it that way. They are a form of robotics, and there's an enormous amount that we want to do that needs to range across those areas. And we've had, I think, frustration in the past and policy failure or policy underperformance by drawing our categories too narrowly when it comes to these, especially China-related technology problems, where we've said, going back 6-7 years, that we have a problem in 5G, and the problem in 5G is especially, the hardware that we're putting into our telecom networks for, the radio access network base station integration. Well, that was true enough as far as it went, and Huawei and ZTE were succeeding in selling this all around the world, and it was disadvantaging, the security and sovereignty of countries all around the world, and there were competitors like Nokia and Ericsson in that specific sector. But to think of it, frankly, as we often did in government and in the public, as a problem of like the 5G, telecom hardware in a narrow way was really damaging. We need to have an appropriately full stack approach to these issues, and we will otherwise burn an enormous amount of policy attention, political will and patience, and crucially time, if we draw these categories too narrowly. It's part of the danger of trying to be kind of overly surgical and overly exquisite with problems that are really fundamentally about too much exposure to the Chinese economy that we've welcomed over 30+ years. And I would say, for example, there's even other areas that are perhaps a little bit outside of our scope for the moment, but look at what the Trump administration is doing, I think, to its very important credit in critical minerals. They're doing important things in domestic regulatory reform, especially around permitting. They're doing important things in the domestic policy and strategy around stockpiling. They're doing important things with strategic capital. They're doing important things with trying to organize favorable trade blocs. And Marco Rubio is welcoming 55 countries to the State Department, and we're negotiating with the Europeans, even the Europeans. These are good and important in critical minerals. We need them all in pharmaceuticals, for example. Another critical low-tech, high-tech area with an enormous amount of economic significance and strategic significance on the line. And so I think when we think of critical vulnerabilities, we shouldn't think of critical minerals alone. We should think of things like pharmaceuticals, certainly. And when we think about cars and car tech, that needs to extend appropriately into robotics and embodied AI, or else we'll just be caught out with the next thing.
Right.
So I just want to comment on David's point about critical minerals, because it's critical. The reality is we're never, ever going to be able to out-subsidize the Chinese. And this is coming from a big government statist guy who loves industrial policy, okay? We're not going to be able to, and of course, the regulatory system we have is, don't even get me started. None of that will be enough if we don't deal with price predation. And that's why we've long argued you need a tariff floor, a price floor on rare earths coming from China, where they cannot price below a certain level, because that's their strategy. And any company going into that market knows that they'll go in there at 1.2 price. That's their cost. And the Chinese will just come in and undercut them in price and drive them out of business. And that's why the Trump administration just supported recently a price floor, which you can't go below. Now, companies who are sort of buying those rare earth metals, they're now okay with it. But for a long time, they were resistant to that because they just wanted cheap rare earths. And again, I go back to my Lenin quote. That's short-term, good for their bottom line, bad for the country, bad for the state. Autos are exactly the same way. We cannot subsidize our way. As we're all for, we just laid out, are laying out in the next 2 weeks, my colleague Stephen Ezell what a national auto strategy would look like. And it includes reg reform, it includes better education and training, includes a lot of things. But without this limit against this ultra mafia-like predation, it's not going to be enough.
And I think, I mean, the ultimate point here, at least from my perspective, is that the CCP state-controlled Chinese economic system and the American free market economic system are fundamentally not compatible. And if we don't acknowledge that reality and treat them as if they are compatible and integrate them maximally, we're going to pay the consequences. And that's where I really appreciate the point you raised, that like reversing the tech transfer playbook is just not going to work. And the reason it's not going to work, as you said, is not, it's because it's the direction of the flow isn't the point. The point is that one system is controlled by the CCP for geopolitical aims, and the other is a free market system in which companies are individually pursuing their own profit. And in that arrangement, the state-controlled side of that will always have the upper hand, and you will get this kind of price predation for political reasons unless you countervail it with your own sound policy.
As Robbie Diamond likes to say, you can't catfish the catfisher.
That's right. Yeah.
So 5 years from now, okay, let's say vehicle prices in the US are down. The auto industry is back on a growth trajectory. We've talked about all the reasons why this won't happen. Out of all of the contributing factors that can give us this futuristic scenario, what is most important for this outcome to be considered even a remote possibility? And as we wrap up here with our last minute, I'd love to hear from each of you on what that one thing is.
Maybe I'll take here the panelist prerogative to just duck a question. I'll offer a quick thought here, watching the clock, about kind of the future policy trajectory, but really with a focus on just the next few weeks, which is the question of what will happen when President Trump goes to Beijing and meets with Xi Jinping. Will this issue be on the table? Probably. Will it result in a U.S. invitation to China to pursue major investment in U.S. automotive? There is what you might call an Amy Winehouse test that can be applied to this. Secretary Lutnick went on TV about a year ago and was asked in a Fox News interview by Laura Ingraham this very question. China will come to us, they will say, we want to adjust the trade terms, we want to help grow jobs in America, we want to invest in car and car tech factories in America. But that'll be devastating for Detroit, won't it? Will you and the Trump administration welcome this? And Howard Lutnick said to Laura Ingraham, Laura, I call that question an Amy Winehouse. The answer is no, no, no. Cute, but also in tension with a view that President Trump has expressed with some consistency over the years on the campaign trail and as president, that he would welcome Chinese car investment, assuming it generates jobs in America. He's strongly against Chinese cars coming in through Mexico, of course. He will tariff them to prevent it, but he has shown a certain consistent openness to Chinese car investment in factories in America that will do things like help jobs. This is a key question that is being worked out inside the administration. It raises really very fundamental questions of economic and national security, and it's a very early policy test that will shape that 5-year arc that the question that I'm avoiding asked about.
Yeah, I just to build off that point, I think it's essential that when the president meets with Xi Jinping, he does not go in with the mentality that the problem is that we have a bad deal, the answer to which is a better deal. I think that might be his natural inclination, to think in terms of deal making. It would be a tremendous mistake to think that we can solve our problem just with a better deal, because the terms of the deal are not the issue. The incompatibility of our economic systems and our political goals are the problem. And to fix that, I think you need two things. One, you need an adequate shield, or just frankly, decoupling strategy to protect us from what Rob was describing. If you don't do that, you're not going to be able to achieve this positive vision for the American auto industry or any of these other affected industries in 5 years at all. Once you do that, then I think it's entirely, and not only is it legitimate, it's essential and urgent to ask the positive side of the question. Well, if we are not running our industries off of cheap Chinese inputs or goods or whatever, Well, how do we make up for that? And there, I think smart industrial policy has everything to do with the solution. I mean, we need something like a national development bank or an industrial finance corporation of the United States, where we can decide that an industry is critical in some way, like critical minerals or autos or whatever else, batteries, and say, the private sector is failing to invest in the following ways. We can use some public capital to unlock that private capital to de-risk it or whatever. Like, we should do that. It's a shield, and then it's investment. It's leveraging the smart industrial policy tools that we've been reluctant to use in the past that we need to relearn how to use. And if we do that, I think it's absolutely possible that the positive vision you sketched is achievable.
Thanks, Chris. Rob, final word?
So, assuming that we have a Trump deal that says no imports and no domestic Chinese production, I don't think we can let the industry off the hook. There are real legitimate advantages that the Chinese EV makers have done that aren't unfair. Lots that are unfair. And one of them is a dramatically reduced number of parts in a vehicle, dramatically improved and increased automation. And our car companies, particularly the big three, but not all of them, not more than that, they still have way too complicated parts catalogs. They still don't adopt robots the way they should. And I think we basically got to say, look, if we're going to give you that protection, if you will, you have to make a commitment to radical transformation. And it's surprising we've had this conversation and we haven't called out who I think is one of the biggest barriers, and that's the UAW. I spoke to a UAW, former high-level UAW guy a few years ago, and I said, hey, given what you know now, when you were in the UAW and you put in these labor restrictions and everything, and you knew they were going to hurt the industry's competitiveness and market share, would you have changed? He said, no, we wouldn't have changed, because if we didn't do that, we would have gotten wildcatted out and somebody else would have taken that. So they're in the exact same position as CEOs, short-term worker interests. And the UAW deal that was done last year, the year before, whatever, was frankly, the wage levels are higher than the German wage levels now in the U.S. And we got to realize that that's not sustainable. Everybody at the table has to sacrifice something, and the auto union needs to be at the front of that line. But at the same time, the CEOs need to listen to their engineers more. We should have a goal that within 5 years, we're going to have the same level of robot adoption as China has today. And I think if you listen to Farley and some of the other leaders, they get that. They know they've got to do that, but it's really a question, can you turn that Titanic ship around before it sinks?
Well, thank you, gentlemen, so much for being with us today. Appreciate the conversation.